So with its integrated scenario manager, it's not so frequently necessary to compare different models in the results program, because most of the routine comparisons you'll be doing in an exercise are more likely to be between different scenarios of the same model. The scenario manager basically makes it much easier to keep all of your different comparisons together in one place and for them to be automatically linked. So day to day it's not so common to need to compare more than one model, but the results program always could do it from way before we had scenarios at all, and it remains a useful thing for it to be able to do, and 7.5 will continue to do that. The most common reason you might want to do it is to compare different versions of the same model, but it can also be useful just to compare overall results at a higher level, just to see how, I don't know, one business case looks to another in terms of its overall payback or whatever. Again, like 7.4, when you open more than one model in STEM 7.5, it does its best to consolidate different run periods, because there's no guarantee they'll be for the same set of years or even quarters or months, and it does its best to consolidate when you have different elements, so it will potentially allow you to draw a graph for an element called DSL shelf, even if that's one of 15 in one model and one of 73 in a different model. It does its best to kind of line them up, and similarly there is the potential, if they have different scenario structures, to still try and find some commonality in them. Actually right now STEM 7.5 basically treats the scenarios of one model completely separately to the scenarios of another, and that's exactly the same as what STEM 7.4 did. You'll see in a minute there is an opportunity here to do something slightly clever again if the models are essentially the same one, but we'll get to that in a minute. So we've actually made it not difficult, but we've made it so you have to fairly conspicuously choose to open more than one set of results, because what you don't want to do is to be in the editor working with one model, switch to a different model and run it, and suddenly end up implicitly having a workspace with multiple results, when nearly always what you want to do is to just switch to the workspace for the other model. So if you actually want to compare results of a second model with the first model, the only way to achieve that end is to be in the results program. So here I am in the results program looking at a model called WiMAX DSL3. It's actually my template version of the WiMAX DSL model, and to compare this with some other results I have to specifically go here and I say I want to actually open some results, and you need to go and look for the ones you want, WiMAX DSL, and even when you do this it's going to say you've already got some other results loaded, do you want to close the current workspace before proceeding? Because again you might want to simply get rid of this and only look at WiMAX DSL, and basically it's only if you click no at this point that it won't close that workspace, which means it's going to leave the WiMAX DSL3 workspace open, and it's going to then add the WiMAX results to it. And you'll now see there are two sets of results mentioned in the caption, and now we've done that, it means you can now compare results between those different models, and let's just see how this works. Effectively we're going to treat extra models like extra sets of scenarios, and just for the record, this is another situation that can lead to the scenarios tab being displayed. So if you have two models that neither of them have any scenarios of their own, if you open both sets of results together, then when you go graph draw or draw new, then you'll see that you'll still get scenarios tab, because it will list the results. And so I've got some elements, I've got some graphs, and so if I then go onto the scenarios tab, what you'll see by default you get is, in general, all of the scenarios of one model up here, followed by all of the scenarios of the other model. And when it's in this default linear selection mode, that's exactly equivalent to how it worked in STEM 7.4. Before we go on, I have to note, which is when you're playing with this at the moment, you need to manually turn on the option to include the model name in the graphs. Otherwise you'll get very confused because you won't be able to tell the difference between them. I think actually it should do that automatically when you've got multiple results loaded, but that's a development thing we still have to resolve. So you get this big list if it's linear selection, and so you could say I want to compare working model WiMAX DSL3 with working model WiMAX DSL, put them both in here. and you go ahead and draw the graph, and there you are. You've got YMAX DSL3, YMAX DSL, working model, DSL access, and it's just comparing the results. And I know this is right because my DSL3 model has template replication, so it's about 10 times bigger than the other one. And so in general you could do this to draw your elements and your graphs, and you'd pick whatever scenarios you wanted. That's all with linear selection, and for exactly the same reason as that gets cumbersome if you have multiple dimensions in one model, then obviously if you have multiple dimensions in both models, then it gets very cumbersome. And so you can still turn this off, and then you'll get a dimensional view, and and so what it's showing you is, first of all, the dimensions for YMAX DSL3, and then the dimensions for YMAX DSL. For a moment I was thinking that I thought those were shown one level further out, but they're not. That's fine. So at the moment the way this works is, I was going to say, and it's lost the working model, but that's the reason it looks funny, is because the working model is already selected. It keeps throwing me when they're not shown here, and actually I think we've agreed that in the scenarios case they are always going to be shown here. So put them back. Okay, that's right. That was what I was expecting. So when you have the working model, it also acts a bit like a heading. It says YMAX DSL3, and then all the dimensions, and then YMAX DSL, and then all the dimensions, and it effectively treats them independently. So I can click base here and do this, and if it was working correctly, I'd get these three options over there, and I can click base here and do this and get the three from here, as it would if it was just one model loaded, and they basically work completely independently. And it's effectively still a linear selection between models, so you're showing your dimensional view for one model, and then completely separate from it, in addition, you're seeing the other one here. Now, what you have to consider is, suppose that both models have exactly the same scenario structure as they do here, and well, actually they don't, because I renamed this to something else to see what would happen, but they are basically the same structure. And obviously if you're comparing different versions of the same model, then mostly they will be the same structure unless you've recently changed them. And you can see that a much nicer approach, rather than listing the same dimensional structure twice, would be to list these dimensions once over, and then what you could have as an additional dimension would be the models. So if you imagine not having this bit down here, and instead you could have model as a dimension, and one of them would be DSL3 and one of them would be YMAX, then if you selected, let's say, just the model, then you'd get all of its variants, and if you selected a model and base, you'd get these three for that model. Or if you selected YMAX and base and none of the models, then you'd get YMAX base for both models. And you can see that you'd effectively be able to treat the model as a dimension in its own right, which I think would actually be a really neat way of doing it. There's no possibility of that being implemented in 7.5 because it's only really an afterthought, but Stuart said to me yesterday that it probably wouldn't be so hard to do, so hopefully we will get that in the end. And it will be a nice improvement when it comes. But the fact is that it's already the case that having that dimensional approach still reaps huge benefits per model compared to how this looks in 7.4, where, just to remind you, in 7.4 you have no option, no alternative but this full splodge like this. So it's already the case that being able to work with these dimensions, even across multiple models, is still going to be a big improvement.